Turkey is calling on the US to stop supporting Kurdish forces inside Syria. Washington says they are crucial to defeat ISIL, but Ankara argues they are a threat to its security. How can the two NATO allies resolve the situation? Confrontation or conciliation? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. When it comes to the war in Syria, Turkey and the US are allies in many ways. They both want Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to step down. They want the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant gone. But when it comes to achieving these goals, the two don't see eye to eye, and that could lead to yet another confrontation in the region. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has warned that the US must cut off support to Kurdish armed groups in the area or face the consequences. At the same time, US troops have been increasing their presence along part of the Turkey-Syria border. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first Hashim Al-Khabara has this report from Gaziantep.
These are US troops patrolling border areas in Hasaka province. Their aim is to de-escalate mounting tensions. Over the last few days, the Turkish army has launched attacks targeting the YPG, or the People's Protection Unit. It's the main Kurdish group operating in northeastern Syria. The YPG is a crucial US ally in the fight against ISIL. But the presence of US troops with YPG fighters has angered Turkey.
It saddened us deeply to see American flags waving in a convoy in which a terrorist organization, that is YPG, also had their so-called flags. We will discuss this with Mr. Trump during our visit on May 16.
Turkey has also deployed troops in Şanlıurfa, not far from where more US troops have been seen. It's raised concerns the two countries might be on a collision course. Turkey considers the YPG a terrorist organization and has recently targeted the group's headquarters in Hasaka province. Ankara has warned its attacks will continue. This all comes at a delicate time for the US-led coalition, which relies on an alliance of Kurds and Arabs known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, to defeat ISIL. These are SDF fighters advancing towards Tabqa city center, but they are facing stiff resistance from ISIL.
We have helped thousands of civilians flee towards safe areas aboard this ferry. We have also helped by offering them food. We distribute food to our fighters near Tabqa, and we give part of it to civilians as well. We transported flour twice to areas near Tabqa and Safsafa.
As the battle intensifies, SDF local commanders gather more fighters around Tabqa. It's the gateway to Raqqa, ISIL's last stronghold in Syria. Thousands of people are fleeing to safe areas, putting more pressure on aid agencies that are struggling to cope with growing numbers of internally displaced people. Hashim Al-Khabara, Al Jazeera.
The Kurdish situation in Turkey and Syria can seem a little bit like acronym soup. So let's take a look at who's in the mix. Most Turkish Kurds live in this southeastern region of the country. There's been a crackdown in the area for a while now, with Turkish soldiers searching for members of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK. The PKK has been fighting for more autonomy. Turkey considers them terrorists. Now, this area is where Syria's Kurdish people have been trying to carve out a territory for themselves. Turkish leaders are worried about how close it is to their border, which is why they've been attacking the Kurdish People's Protection Units, or YPG, in Syria. But the YPG is part of the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, which is a rebel alliance backed by the US. The SDF is largely considered the most effective force fighting ISIL in Syria. Now let's get the thoughts of our guests joining us. In Washington, D.C., Henri, Barkey, Director of the Middle East Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. In Istanbul, Metin Gürcan, security analyst and columnist for Al Monitor. And in Washington, too, Bülent Alireza, Director and Senior Associate at Turkey Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Bülent Alireza, firstly, welcome to all three of you. Let's get to the bottom of the Turkey-US relationship right now. What's happening at the moment?
Well, what's happening is that Mr. Erdogan is preparing to meet Mr. Trump on May 16th, which is exactly 4 years to the day that he was last at the White House, where he had a meeting with President Obama, and they disagreed fundamentally on Syria, which frankly is the origin of the problem that we're discussing today. What happened is that Mr. Erdogan pushed Mr. Obama to commit resources to achieve the common aim, which was the ouster of Assad in Syria. Obama demurred, and U.S. and Turkish policies towards Syria began to diverge. The U.S. hit the brakes on supporting the opposition and began to focus only on what it saw as the jihadist threat. And Turkey gave more support to the opposition. And we've ended up in a current situation in which they disagree fundamentally. This happened with Obama, and it's continuing with Trump. They disagree fundamentally over the U.S. reliance on the YPG, because Turkey considers the YPG to be linked to the PKK, which both Turkey and the U.S. consider to be a terrorist organization. The U.S., in its desire to use them as the most effective fighting force against ISIS, basically says, yes, the PKK is a terrorist organization for me, but the YPG is an organization that I'm going to continue to cooperate with. And we now have this confrontation between the two sides. And frankly, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Okay, so that's beautifully brought us to where we are now. Henri, Barkey, do you agree with that? Do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better? How dangerous is it right now?
Well, it is fairly dangerous. I mean, because last week you had major Turkish incursions and bombings of YPG position. 20 YPG fighters were killed. This is at a time when every YPG fighter is needed to fight in Raqqa and Takba, the two targets that the United States is after in Syria, where ISIS is holding. So now that the Americans have physically put themselves in between the Turks and the YPG, the risk is if the Turks were to bomb again and suddenly hit American soldiers or American troop encampments and kill Americans, then we will have a terrible crisis in our hands between Turkey and the United States at a time when already relations are quite tenuous. The Trump meeting, the Trump-Erdogan meeting at the White House is interesting in the sense that there is very little at the moment the two leaders can agree upon. And I think what Trump is trying to do, as he does with other leaders, is somehow, if he thinks that he can talk to them, they somehow will agree to what he thinks and to his positions. I don't think this is going to happen. Erdogan is coming with a long laundry list of demands, and he's quite adamant now to get them.
All right. Metin Gürcan, I'm going to pick up on that point that the previous guest has just raised, Henri has just raised, about the potential danger. I mean, what we've got at the moment are US troops keeping its two allies away from each other. But what if something were to go wrong? What if somebody were to get caught in a crossfire, for example?
Yes, ma'am. I mean, let me try to simplify already increasingly complex setting. We have two facts. We have one confusion and we have two dilemmas. The first fact is that President Erdogan, the ultimate decision maker in Ankara, has been feeling himself empowered after getting what he wanted from the recent constitutional referendum, and the congratulations call from President Trump. And also, we have to see this fact. He has full support of the state security apparatus and also popular support in the fight against PKK in Syria. We saw this in the, Eurofist Shield.
And we've also seen it more recently in Iraq as well at the same time, because I was going to ask you about the timing.
That's right. That's right. And this is the first fact. The second fact is about the timing. I think he has been pushing the strategic decision-making mechanism in the States, in D.C., just before the anticipated meeting with President Trump. And Ankara knows this fact very well, that this is the last chance for Ankara to influence the U.S. strategic decision-making mechanism. And here comes the confusion. I think the Trump administration, President Trump and his inner circle, they are more inclined to negotiate with President Erdogan in a sort of transactional fashion about the things going on in Iraq and in Syria. But the U.S. security apparatus, particularly the Pentagon CENTCOM in charge of the fight against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria, they have a sort of differentiating position on this issue. So this creates a sort of confusion within the strategic decision-making mechanism of the United States. So Ankara knows this. So Ankara has been pushing hard, you know, to influence this. And also two dilemmas, ma'am. I mean, these are extremely important. The first dilemma is U.S. and the U.S. decision makers. They have to address this crucial question: how to assure Ankara, just before the anticipated Raqqa offense, not to do something crazy like invading the Kobani and Jazeera cantons in the east of Euphrates, because Ankara has 2 armored brigades and 3 mechanized brigades right now sitting at the borderline, and they are waiting for the order from Ankara. So,
okay, so it's all pretty tenuous.
Ankara,
let's put this to Henri. What can the US say at the moment to placate Turkey and say, right, look, we're still on your side, but, you know, we might disagree about who we're going to be fighting with? Is that going to be enough for Ankara, or is Ankara going to need a little bit more?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think when you look at the American objectives in terms of Raqqa and also Mosul, both the Pentagon and the White House are determined to win Raqqa, or to get ISIS out of Raqqa as soon as possible. And this is both for the Pentagon and for Trump, #1 priorities. For Trump, it is because he wants to say, look, I liberated Raqqa, Obama couldn't do it. There's that aspect to it. But for Pentagon, strategically speaking, in terms of what it is they want to achieve, Raqqa is critical. And there is no other force capable of taking Raqqa at the moment. No Syrian force, I should say. Therefore, the United States is not going to give in terms of this cooperation with the YPG. It might, in exchange for Turkish presence, say, look, I will give you more stuff on the PKK, I'll give you more intelligence on the PKK, and kind of make that distinction between the PKK and the YPG. That will not satisfy Ankara, but the truth is that Ankara doesn't have much of a choice, because the United States is determined to do it and will do it no matter what.
So no matter what cost. Bülent, I mean, clearly the US knows that Turkey is upset. This recent action has been linked to US alliances with these Kurdish forces. What can the US do now? I mean, are they prepared to soil this relationship in the way that they're doing it? Is it worth it?
I think Trump wants both things at the same time, and it's going to be very difficult to achieve. By that I mean he wants a good relationship with Turkey, but he also wants to take Raqqa, as he promised during the campaign, as soon as possible. Yeah, your guest in Istanbul actually touched on it, so let me expand it on it a little bit. The White House Pentagon dimension of the issue. When Mr. Trump came in, he inherited a plan for an upgraded relationship, for an expanded relationship with the Kurds. And he asked General Mattis and the Pentagon to review it. He gave them 30 days. And what happened is that at the end of that review, which came at the end of February, the Pentagon decided to continue with the Obama policy. And the Pentagon, and particularly CENTCOM, which is in charge of the operation in Syria, has provided more material and more support for the YPG. Now, the fact is that Mr. Trump, having appointed lots and lots of generals into key positions in his administration, led by General Mattis at the Pentagon, has made it clear that he will defer to them on operational issues. his national security advisor, who's also a general, McMaster, was on TV yesterday saying how there's no longer micromanagement out of the White House. So the Pentagon is going to go ahead with the general instructions, general direction that's been provided by Trump at the White House, which is to go take Raqqa, and that means relying on the YPG. If Mr. Trump can actually persuade Mr. Erdogan to continue with a good relationship in spite of this fundamental divergence on Syria, that will be tribute to his abilities at human relations, something that...
Okay, Metin, I've got two questions for you. Are the Turkish troops not up to the job? Are they not as effective as the Kurdish troops? And if so, why not? And I'm just wondering what the Kurds will want in return for working with the US. They're going to want something.
I have to say this. Ankara right now, instead of offering those Ankara-backed Free Syrian Army proxies, I think in the forthcoming meeting with Trump admin, Ankara will highly likely offer the Turkish military to do the heavy lifting on the ground. And this will be Ankara's, I think, last offer to the United States. But also, I have to emphasize this. The Raqqa
what if the
operation
United States
will
doesn't
have
want it, because they don't seem to want to go that route?
Here comes this strategic confusion. Right now, the CENTCOM has already done operational plans at hand, including the YPG forces. But what Ankara has been offering is the exclusion of YPG forces and going with a new plan. So how Trump admin, read these two conflicting, approaches? Will Ankara offer more aside for a Raqqa operation to the Trump admin? We don't know that. But at the end of the day, I think this is the biggest challenge for the Trump administration, to go with CENTCOM's already done plans with YPG, or to go with Ankara's new offerings. But the point also, I have to emphasize that Raqqa operation will not be a sort of easy prey. Like Mosul operation, we will be maybe talking about, for months about this Raqqa operation, and it has first capturing phase, and then holding phase, and then post-conflict reconstruction phase. Here comes the dilemma for the American decision makers. In the capturing phase, okay, they will go with YPG, but we are talking about a city with the population of 99% of Sunni Arabs. So we are talking about 300,000 people living there.
Okay, let me bring in Henri quickly, if I may.
Phases.
Sorry, can I just bring in Henri quickly?
Yes, ma'am.
Using the YPG, certainly it'll embolden them, and we know that Turkey is petrified of the Kurds and their aspirations. How much of a threat is YPG to Turkey? And I'm just wondering what the Kurds will want in return for working alongside the US.
Well, that's a very good question. First of all, the YPG is, even though it has links to the PKK, was created or trained by the PKK, is fundamentally still a Syrian organization. It is composed mostly of Syrian Kurds, although there are Kurds from other parts as well. The threat that the YPG poses to Turkey is not a military threat. It is a psychological threat. Because if you think about it, back in 1991, 1993, when we looked at Iraqi Kurdistan, we never thought that Iraqi Kurdistan would amount to much, but it did. Today there is a separate Iraqi Kurdish government. It's not independent, but it is close to independence. The fear for Ankara is that the same thing will happen in Syria as well, and therefore that you will have now two contiguous territories where the Kurds will be ruling directly or indirectly large chunks of territory. And what does this mean ultimately for Turkish Kurds? Turkey, as you mentioned earlier, or you set up to your program, Turkey has been fighting the Turkish Kurds for more than 30 years, and they haven't won. They haven't won against the PKK, despite the fact that this is the second largest army in NATO, because the Kurdish problem is very deep and deeply rooted in Turkey, and it will not disappear. So what Erdogan is afraid of, that the YPG, because of its alliance with the United States, just like the Iraqi Kurds had an alliance with the United States, will ultimately emerge in Syria as an autonomous region.
Okay,
and that will
let me bring Bülent in here now. Do you think this is a turning point for the Kurds? Are they at the cusp of something big, getting what they want?
Well, you know, it's interesting that not only do they have a relationship with Washington and the support of the U.S. Special Forces provided by CENTCOM east of the Euphrates and in the fight for Raqqa, but they also have Russian support in the canton of Afrin on the other side of Syria, below the Turkish-Syrian border. And in fact, Foreign Minister Lavrov, in the peace conference in Astana, in which Turkey participated, distributed a non-paper looking at the possibility of a Kurdish autonomy in Syria, something that the Syrian government previously rejected out of hand, but obviously in deference to the wishes of its main ally, Russia, it is no longer rejecting. So we're talking about the Syrian Kurds achieving autonomy of some kind or other with the implicit acceptance of the Syrian government in whatever formation emerges at the end of the current ongoing war in Syria. Now, this is obviously something that Turkey has rejected, continues to reject, and is threatening to use military force.
Okay, Metin, let me bring in Russia here. Let me pick up on your point that you made about Russia. I mean, how will Russia sit into this situation at the moment? Because the Russians and the US are working quite closely in fighting ISIL and with the YPG. So where's the fallout going to happen there?
Yes, ma'am. I mean, I have to say this. I mean, we have a border. We have an unspoken border in the north of Syria. In the west of Euphrates, we see the Russians' increasing influence. In the east of Euphrates, we see the U.S. influence in terms of airspace dominance. I think U.S., with a sort of short-sighted vision, has been concentrating on the things on the ground. But Russia, with a sort of political vision, a long-term political vision, has been trying to deepen its engagement with those Kurds in the north of Syria. So I would say that Russia has more long-term and political vision when tailoring its strategies in terms of Syria's Kurds. And also, let me say this, why the Syria Kurds, they are important in the post-ISIS setting. The center-peripheral relationship between Damascus and the Syria Kurds will determine all political structures in Syria. So in the post-ISIS setting, the Syrian Kurds will continue to be the strategic assets for all actors who have stakes in the Syria and in the future of Syria.
Excuse me, jumping in. Let me ask Henri about these actors, and you're right, there are so many players involved in what's happening in Syria and that region. What is your feeling now? Is there a collision course, or do you think that we'll be able to pull back from the tensions, the growing tensions we are seeing on that border?
Well, look, the biggest unknown at the moment in Syria is not so much what's happening in the north as much as what is happening in Damascus. That is to say, we still cannot see a way out of the quagmire in Syria. And until that is resolved, it will be very difficult to figure out what will happen to the Kurdish regions of Syria. So we need to look at it with a long-term perspective. Just like, as I said earlier, the United States got involved in Iraq in support of the Kurds, not necessarily because it wanted to help the Kurds, but it was an ally against Saddam. The United States is getting involved with the Kurds in Syria against ISIS. So there's a parallel there. But if you take the parallel further down, you will see that there will be growing American influence in Syria because the war against ISIS is going to last much longer than we expect. And the Russians are also going to get involved. So at some point, there will have to be a deal between the United States and Russia as to what to do with the Kurds, because the Kurds by then will be far too strong to just abandon or muzzle. So ultimately, there will be some kind of confederal or federal arrangement in Syria, but we're talking about a very long time period, and we shouldn't expect that things will quiet down anytime soon.
All right, Henri, Barkey, with those concluding words, thank you very much. Thank you to Metin Gurcan and Bülent Arıza. And thank you for watching. As always, you can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, please go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine is @Jane Dutton. But for me and the rest of the team, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.